James Morrison walked into a $2 billion factory carrying a toolbox so battered that the security guards thought he'd pulled it from a scrapyard. Victoria Sterling, the young and cold chief executive officer whom everyone whispered about, looked at his rusted wrenches and laughed in front of her entire leadership team. "Do you really think that thing can fix my factory?" she asked loudly enough for the cameras to capture. James said nothing. He simply closed the lid of his toolbox and stepped aside. 3 hours later, the entire motor line shut down without warning. Millions of dollars evaporating by the minute, and Victoria realized that the man she had just humiliated was the only living person who could save her empire. If stories about proud people who finally learn humility resonate with you, stay close because what comes next will stay with you. The Wedlock Gold Ford plant stood across the Ohio landscape like a monument built to intimidate. Journalists called it the industrial diamond of the decade, a $2 billion facility designed to manufacture the core engines for the next generation of electric vehicles. Government contracts were rumored to be within reach along with alliances from 3 of the country's largest automakers. Every surface gleamed. Every robotic arm moved with the practiced precision of a symphony. The plan had been built to prove that the Sterling family still belonged at the top of American industry, and today was the day that proof would be delivered to the world. Victoria Sterling moved through the facility in a tailored white suit and heels that clicked against the polished concrete like a countdown. She walked ahead of her executives like a queen walks ahead of her court. Chin raised, eyes scanning for anything imperfect. In less than 6 hours, the plant would execute its final test before its most important investor arrived, a man named Edward Pardo, to decide whether his fund would continue backing the project. Nothing could go wrong. Victoria had spent 3 years of her life proving she deserved her father's company, and she was not going to let one faulty morning ruin it. While she rehearsed her opening remarks in her head, an old pickup truck rattled into the employee parking lot outside. James Morrison climbed down slowly, dressed in a faded denim jacket and work boots that had clearly seen 20 years of use. He carried a metal case with chipped paint and rust spreading along its hinges. The kind of case that seemed to belong in a junkyard rather than alongside a billion-dollar facility. Security stopped him at the gate, certain he had wandered in by mistake. James explained quietly that he had been called to inspect the number 7 alignment shaft before the test began. The name James Morrison appeared nowhere on the visitor list reserved for engineers and consultants. A junior guard radioed to confirm. And that was when Benjamin Cross, the plant's operations director, approached to see what was causing the delay. Benjamin looked James up and down, taking note of the worn boots and the ancient toolbox, and allowed himself a thin, condescending smile. He assumed some low-level maintenance contractor had been sent by mistake from an overworked scheduling department. Still, he gestured for James to pass. Not out of respect, but because he sensed an opportunity for entertainment in front of the executive team. As James walked alongside the main production line, he slowed unintentionally. He heard the low hum of the stamping press, the way most people hear a familiar song, catching a note that did not belong there. Quietly, he murmured that something was half a beat out of rhythm. A nearby young engineer overheard and laughed, glancing at a monitor showing all indicators glowing healthy green. No one else in the building had noticed anything wrong. James simply nodded to himself and kept walking, tightening his grip on the handle of the toolbox that had accompanied him for over 2 decades. Benjamin escorted James toward the central command floor where Victoria stood alongside Edward Pardo reviewing a live diagnostic screen. He made a show of the introduction, raising his voice enough to draw attention from nearby staff. "Here," he announced with a mocking smile, "is the man supposedly sent to rescue America's most advanced factory using a rusty metal box." Several junior employees laughed nervously, unsure whether laughing at a guest in front of the CEO was appropriate but following Benjamin's lead anyway. Victoria turned, and for a moment her expression was less amusement than genuine disbelief at what stood before her. She studied the toolbox as James set it down and opened the latches. Inside were hand-ground wrenches, a manual thickness gauge worn from years of use, dial indicators with faded numbers, and several custom tools forged from steel that had long since lost its shine. Victoria asked with a tone of theatrical curiosity why he had not brought laser measuring equipment, smart sensors, or thermal imaging scanners like every other technician who passed through her doors. James replied simply that there were things a computer could not hear, but he could. The comment sparked another wave of laughter from the small group gathered around them. Victoria crossed her arms unimpressed and told him clearly that her factory did not run on garage tricks passed down from another century. She said it loudly enough that anyone within 30 feet could hear the insult. She told him his tools belonged behind glass in a museum, not inside a facility responsible for the future of American manufacturing. Benjamin added fuel to the fire, calling James a relic and asking whether he had learned his trade before or after the moon landing. James's expression did not change. He only directed his attention toward shaft number 7, studying it like a doctor studies a patient that no one else believes is sick. Quietly, without anger in his voice, James told them that if they ran the line at full capacity, the resonance coupling on that shaft would cease in 4 hours. Victoria assumed it was a scare tactic, a strange bid for attention or payment from a man clearly out of his depth. She ordered security to escort him off the operations floor immediately, unwilling to let a stranger's odd claim distract from the historic test about to begin. When 2 guards stepped forward to escort him, James stopped and looked directly at Maria Espinosa, the chief engineer standing near the console. He told her that when the green light turned white, she must never cut the power because if she did, the system would lock permanently. No one understood what he meant. Maria frowned, filing the strange warning somewhere she could not quite explain, while Victoria simply laughed and told him her warning lights did not come in that color. The doors closed behind James Morrison, and within minutes the incident had already become office gossip. A story about the strange old mechanic who tried to scare the CEO with nonsense about a light that did not exist. Victoria smoothed her jacket, forced her attention back to Edward Pardo, and resumed the tour as if nothing unusual had happened. She had no idea that the man she had just dismissed had spoken the only true warning anyone would give her that day. Outside in the parking lot, James climbed into his old truck but did not start the engine immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about the last time he had walked those floors as an employee rather than as a stranger being escorted by security. He remembered when the plant was a fraction of its current size, when every machine on the line had been calibrated by hand because no one trusted computers to feel what the steel told them. He thought briefly of his late wife, of the years he had spent building something he could no longer claim as his own, and of the daughter who had grown up watching him choose her over a career. He started the engine and drove away, hoping never to see the inside of that building again. The official test began exactly as scheduled, with cameras rolling and reporters gathered along a cordoned section of the observation platform. Victoria presented Wedlock Gold Ford as the future of American industry, her voice steady and rehearsed, every word designed to reassure the investors who had bet billions on her vision. Walter Sterling sat in the front row of honored guests, his expression carved from stone, watching his daughter with the particular scrutiny of a man who had built an empire and expected nothing less than perfection from whoever would inherit it. For the first few minutes, everything ran exactly as promised. The screens on the command floor showed an impeccable efficiency rating of 97%. The robotic arms moved in perfect synchronization. The engine slid off the assembly line in a smooth, uninterrupted flow, and applause sounded among the crowd as the first completed motor core rolled toward the packaging area. Victoria allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief, believing the hardest part of the day was behind her. Walter gave her the faintest nod of approval from his seat, the kind of gesture that meant more to her than any headline the press could write. Later that afternoon, Maria Espinosa noticed at first a barely perceptible vibration in shaft number 7 that did not register anywhere on the main diagnostic panel. It was subtle, almost imaginary, but matched precisely what James had described only hours before. That same half-beat misalignment she reported to Benjamin, expecting him to authorize a brief pause to investigate, but he dismissed her without even looking at her data. He was not going to interrupt the most important presentation of his career over what he assumed was an oversensitive sensor glitch. Maria returned to her station uneasy, her eyes returning to the reading every few seconds. Victoria also caught a flicker on one of the secondary screens, a small anomaly buried under layers of otherwise perfect statistics. She asked her technical team about it and was assured it was nothing more than a rounding error in the coolant temperature readings. She chose to trust the system because admitting that a man she had just publicly ridiculed might be right would have felt like a slap to her own face in front of the entire industry. The moment passed, swallowed by the celebratory noise of camera flashes and applause that continued building around the successful test. 18 motors into the run, one of the motors emitted a short, sharp squeal that lasted less than a second before disappearing under the ambient noise of the factory floor. None of the guests noticed. Maria did, and the color drained from her face as she recalled James's words about a green light turning white. She opened the resonance monitor and watched as the readings climbed in a pattern that no longer resembled coincidence. Just as Victoria prepared to step forward and formally declare the test a triumphant success, The master control panel shifted from a steady green to a ghostly pale white. It was not red. It was not the familiar amber of a routine warning. It was a color that existed in none of the plant's modern documentation, an old legacy signal buried deep in the machine's original architecture. Maria shouted across the floor for everyone to leave the power alone. Her voice cracked with an urgency no one had ever heard from her before. Benjamin, panicking at the sight of the unknown alert, overrode her instruction and ordered an emergency shutdown to protect what he assumed was a failing system. The moment his finger left the switch, silence swallowed the entire building. Nothing came back online. The robotic arms froze mid-motion. The conveyor belt locked rigid. And the main shaft rejected every reset command sent through the network. A single error code blinked on every monitor in the command center, one that none of the modern engineering staff had encountered before, reading simply that manual realignment was required at a legacy access point. The documentation team searched frantically through digital archives and found nothing because Wedlock's mechanical core had been built on an older foundation that predated the recent software overhaul entirely. Even the original software provider admitted over the phone that they had no answer for a code so deep in the system's history. The journalists who had been led to the observation platform for a celebratory press moment now whispered among themselves, sensing that the story they had come to write had completely changed. Camera operators kept their lenses trained on the frozen assembly line, capturing every second of stillness that would later air on business channels across the country under headlines no one at Wedlock Industrial wanted to read. Security guards moved silently to block the exits leading to the press section, trying to buy time before anyone outside the building understood the scale of what had just happened. Inside the command center, phones rang without pause, each call from another investor or partner demanding to know why the factory that was supposed to define the future of American manufacturing had gone completely dark less than an hour into its most important test. Edward Pardo's patience was wearing thin by the minute as he watched millions of dollars evaporate with every second the line remained dark. He reminded Victoria in the calm, terrifying tone of a man who never needed to raise his voice that a single day of downtime could jeopardize the government contract entirely, along with every alliance tied to it. Outside the building, journalists who had come to celebrate a triumph were already writing headlines about catastrophic failure at the nation's most celebrated new factory. Victoria felt the weight of every camera and every silent judgment pressing down on her at once, and for the first time in years she had no idea what to do. She next ordered Maria to mobilize every available engineer, authorizing emergency flights for specialists from Germany, Japan, and California. The earliest any of them could arrive was 24 hours. Yet the contract required the line to be operational before dawn. Walter Sterling pulled his daughter aside, his voice colder than any shout could be, warning her that if this factory failed, the company's stock would collapse and the board would begin questioning whether she was truly fit to lead what he had built. Victoria nodded, swallowing the fear rising in her throat because there was no version of this conversation in which she was allowed to look frightened. Benjamin tried to shift the blame toward the strange old man from that morning, suggesting with false confidence that perhaps James had sabotaged the system out of spite for being escorted out. Maria turned on him immediately, reminding the room that James had warned them precisely hours before any of this happened, and that dismissing his warning was the real reason they now sat in darkness. A senior maintenance technician standing near the back of the room studied the error code glowing faintly on a backup screen and murmured that he had only ever known one person who understood that particular signal. He said the name quietly, almost reverently, as if speaking it aloud might summon a memory long buried under corporate history. James Morrison, he said, and the room went still. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape she did not want to see. The man she had ridiculed in front of investors, journalists, and her own father might be the only person capable of saving the factory that bore her family's name. She thought of the rust on his tools, the calm certainty in his voice, and the warning about a white light she had laughed off as nonsense only hours before. For the first time that day, her pride felt smaller than her fear. Maria returned to the archives room and began excavating old blueprints stored on servers no one had touched in years, eventually uncovering a name buried within the oldest engineering plans of the Wedlock line. James Morrison was not simply a mechanic who had wandered in by chance. He had once been the chief engineer responsible for designing the manual alignment system that governed the plant's resonance shafts, back when electronic sensors were still too rudimentary to trust with delicate calibration work. Decades earlier, when Wedlock Industrial had acquired a small machine shop called Morrison Toolworks, James had been its chief engineer and its heart, the man who understood every bolt and every vibration within the equipment he had built with his own hands. His custom tools, the very ones Victoria had ridiculed that morning, were not signs of neglect or poverty. They were precision instruments he had shaped, sharpened, and calibrated himself over more than 20 years, designed to read a machine through touch, pressure, and sound in ways no digital sensor of that era could replicate. Years before the plant's expansion, James's wife had fallen gravely ill, and instead of fighting for recognition or compensation, he quietly walked away from the company to care for her and their young daughter. He filed no lawsuits, sought no headlines, and asked for nothing when he left. Over time, corporate records simply stopped mentioning his name until almost no one at Wedlock Industrial remembered he had existed. Victoria read the old files with a growing sense of shame settling in her chest. She had not ridiculed some outdated stranger who had wandered onto her property by mistake. She had ridiculed the very architect of the system that now held her company's future hostage. A man who understood the mechanical soul of the factory more deeply than her entire engineering department combined. Yet something stubborn in her resisted the idea of picking up the phone and apologizing openly. She told Maria to invite James back, but her tone carried the flavor of someone granting a favor rather than someone asking forgiveness. Maria looked directly into her employer's eyes and said without hesitation that an invitation was not enough. She told Victoria plainly that she needed to go and beg the man to return, because a phone call from an assistant would never undo the public humiliation he had endured that morning. Victoria balked at the suggestion, unaccustomed to being told what she needed to do by someone below her on the org chart. Yet even as her pride resisted, she understood that Maria was right and that the only way forward ran directly through the man she had insulted. In front of the cameras, Victoria and Maria drove to the outskirts of town where James's small garage was wedged between a hardware store and an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Unlike the gleaming corridors of Wedlock, this place was modest but immaculate. Every tool hung in careful order. Faded photographs of old machines lined the walls alongside yellowed certificates, and a few hand-drawn blueprints framed with evident pride. James was bent over a water pump belonging to a local farmer when the two women entered, and he did not seem surprised to see them. Without turning around, he asked simply whether the white light had finally appeared. Victoria tried to cling to some fragment of her executive composure, offering him 10 times his usual rate to return and fix the line immediately. James declined, and it was clear from his tone that money had never been the problem at all. He told her that the factory had not broken because of outdated technology, but because the people running it were too arrogant to listen to the one person who truly understood it. Victoria felt her jaw tighten at the accusation, but before she could respond, Maria stepped forward and admitted her own fault in having doubted him that morning, offering an apology that sounded painfully sincere. The atmosphere in the small garage softened slightly at Maria's honesty, and James finally set down his wrench to look directly at both women. He laid out his conditions clearly. Benjamin would have no involvement in the repair. Maria would receive full technical authority during the fix, and Victoria herself would stand before the operations team and admit publicly that she had been wrong to mock him. He made it clear that he did not want a florid apology or a manufactured show of remorse for the cameras, only the simple truth spoken plainly where her employees could hear it. Victoria balked at first, insisting that a CEO could not afford to lose face in front of her own staff. James looked at her steadily and told her that she had already lost the factory, so face was the only thing she had left to spend. The words hit harder than anything her father or the board had said to her all day. Her phone buzzed ceaselessly in her pocket, filled with panicked messages about falling stock prices, demands for an emergency board meeting, and a single cold message from her father that said only 2 words, "Fix it." Something inside her finally broke, and she accepted all the conditions without further argument, understanding for the first time that survival mattered more than pride. James picked up his old toolbox, closed the garage behind him, and climbed into Victoria's car without a word of triumph or satisfaction. Neither woman spoke much during the drive back to the plant, the silence heavy with everything that had changed in the span of a single afternoon. Somewhere after the second traffic light, Victoria finally broke the silence and asked him how he had known all those hours earlier that a shutdown would trigger something so catastrophic. James answered without looking away from the window, saying that machines built before everyone trusted computers were designed to protect themselves. The only way they knew how, locking themselves firmly and refusing to move until a human being cared enough to listen. Victoria turned the words over in her mind for the rest of the journey, unable to shake the feeling that she was no longer talking only about the factory. When they arrived at Wedlock, The atmosphere on the factory floor had transformed completely from the mocking energy of that morning to something closer to held breath and silent dread. The employees who had laughed at James hours earlier now stood in uncomfortable silence as he passed among them toward the command center. Benjamin tried to maintain his usual air of superiority, but the confidence had visibly drained from his posture, replaced by a nervous energy he could not fully hide. Victoria gathered the entire operations team in the central hall and, standing before dozens of employees who had witnessed her cruelty that morning, admitted plainly that she had misjudged James Morrison based solely on his appearance and his tools. She announced that she was granting him full authority over the recovery effort until the line was completely restored. A decision that visibly stunned several senior staff members who had never seen her yield to anyone. It was undoubtedly the first big reversal of the day. The man who had been escorted out by security now stood at the center of the same command floor that had rejected him. James did not gloat, did not raise his voice, and did not waste a single moment savoring the shift in power around him. He simply opened his toolbox, arranged his instruments with practiced care, and began assigning tasks to engineers who had spent the morning mocking his rusted equipment. His quiet confidence weighed more than any speech could have because his competence was doing all the talking it needed. When Benjamin tried to interject, arguing that safety protocols prohibited the use of hand tools on machinery worth billions, James simply asked him whether he understood what the A17 error code actually meant. Benjamin had no answer, and the silence that followed said everything. James calmly explained to the assembled team that the code was not a software failure at all, but a self-protective state built into the oldest mechanical architecture of the resonance shaft, one that activated automatically whenever power was cut at the wrong moment during a misalignment. Unlocking it required manual recalibration done by hand in a precise sequence of pressure, timing, and sound that no digital scanner had ever been designed to replicate. Maria began to understand at last why all the modern tools in her arsenal had failed to diagnose the problem. This machine carried what James called a mechanical memory embedded in design choices from decades ago, and he among everyone present still knew how to read it. James walked onto the main production floor and asked for all secondary monitors in the room to be powered down, leaving only essential background systems running. The silence that followed was so complete that the faint tick of vibration within his toolbox became audible across the entire chamber. He placed an old wrench against the steel shaft, not turning it immediately, but bringing his ear close to listen for something the rest of the room could not perceive. A young engineer whispered that the technique made no logical sense, and Maria silenced him with a sharp look before he could say another word. Within minutes, James discovered that the problem was much deeper than the single shaft everyone had blamed. 3 separate points had misaligned in sequence. Shaft number 7, a secondary coolant valve, and a torque lock inside the second compression chamber. If they had simply reset the shaft alone, the line might have run smoothly for 10 minutes before failing catastrophically somewhere else entirely. He was not repairing one broken piece, he explained. He was saving the integrity of the entire mechanical system before it could tear itself apart under pressure. The room's initial skepticism dissolved into something closer to, or as they began to grasp the extent of what he had understood within moments of walking through the door. The pressure in the room intensified further when Edward Pardo appeared on a video call from the boardroom, announcing bluntly that if the line was not operational in 90 minutes, he would activate the contract withdrawal clause and pull his backing funds entirely. Walter Sterling watched his daughter from across the room with an expression that needed no words, communicating clearly that her entire career now rested in the hands of a man she had publicly humiliated only hours before. Benjamin, desperate to salvage some fragment of relevance, silently attempted to issue a secondary reset command from an auxiliary console to make James's methods appear too slow to matter. Maria detected the unauthorized command before it could execute and blocked it immediately, alerting Victoria to what had happened in real time. For the first time all day, Victoria directed her full fury not at James but at her own operations director, ordering Benjamin to remain silent for the rest of the recovery in a tone that left no room for argument. James continued his work unbothered, giving precise instructions as if conducting a dangerous and silent symphony. He asked Maria to hold pressure steady at 32%. He instructed another engineer to open a specific valve for exactly 11 seconds. And he asked Victoria herself to place her hand on the backup power switch and hold it firmly without letting go. It was a small but symbolic shift. The CEO was no longer standing on the sidelines giving orders from a distance, but participating physically in the survival of the machine she was responsible for. As his hands worked steadily against the steel, James spoke briefly about why he had left wedlock all those years ago, his voice low and even, carrying no bitterness despite the weight of the memory. When his wife had fallen seriously ill, he had asked the leadership of that era for reduced hours so he could care for her, and instead they treated him as easily replaceable, a cog rather than a person. After she passed, he chose his daughter over the company without a moment's hesitation, walking away from everything he had built rather than let his daughter grow up without him. He told them that he bore no hatred for what had happened, but that he had never forgotten the particular sting of being seen as nothing more than a tool. Victoria said nothing in response, the silence around her heavier than any words could have been. She understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that she had repeated the exact mistake of the previous generation, valuing convenience and appearance over the people who actually built the things she claimed to be proud of. She watched James's weathered hands move with complete certainty through the machinery that had defeated an entire team of credentialed engineers and felt something in her understanding of leadership quietly rearrange itself. When James finally slid his old gauge into the narrow gap along the shaft and the trembling needle settled perfectly still, he exhaled and said quietly that now, finally, the machine could breathe again. James gave the order to bring the systems back online section by section, carefully watching as each subsystem responded to his careful sequence. The pale white warning light flickered and finally disappeared, replaced by the familiar steady green that had glowed there before everything went wrong. The first robotic arm shuddered back to life, followed by the conveyor belt sliding smoothly into motion. And then the compression chamber settled into a deep, even rhythm with no trace of the squeal that had doomed the earlier run. Every person in the command center counted each completed motor emerging from a line, sliding smoothly toward the packaging area exactly as it should. The room erupted the moment the reading confirmed a steady efficiency rating of 99.2%, higher than anything achieved during that morning's original demonstration. The engineers who had laughed at James hours earlier now looked at him with something close to reverence as Maria allowed herself the first real smile she had shown all day. James did not join the celebration. He simply wiped his old wrench with a soft cloth and returned it carefully to its place within the toolbox, treating the moment with the same quiet dignity he had carried since walking through the doors that morning. Victoria watched him from a few steps away, unable to fully reconcile the humility of the man before her with the arrogance she had shown him only hours before. Watching remotely through the video call, Edward Pardo's expression shifted from barely concealed disdain to something resembling respect, and he asked directly who the man responsible for the recovery was. Walter Sterling answered before his daughter could speak, saying quietly that James Morrison was a man his family should never have allowed to be forgotten. He continued, revealing in front of the assembled board members listening through the call that many of the foundational patents underpinning the entire Wedlock production line had originated from James's original designs at Morrison Toolworks decades earlier. Although the intellectual property had been legally transferred to Wedlock Industrial through the original acquisition, morally speaking, James was the true architect upon whom the entire factory had been built. This revelation placed Victoria in an impossible position in front of everyone who mattered most to her company's future. If she continued treating James as a temporary contractor brought in to fix an embarrassing emergency, she risked losing the respect of every engineer and technician who had just witnessed his mastery firsthand. If she acknowledged the deeper truth publicly, she would have to accept that her family's celebrated success had been quietly built on the uncredited work of a man they had forgotten and then ridiculed without a second thought. Benjamin, sensing an opportunity to save his position, tried to argue that James had simply gotten lucky with an obscure legacy system no one else understood. Maria silenced him instantly by showing the system logs, proving that both the earlier incorrect shutdown and the unauthorized reset attempt during the recovery traced back directly to his own credentials. Victoria did not need to make a scene or raise her voice to handle what came next. She simply suspended Benjamin on the spot, ordering an internal investigation into his conduct throughout the crisis. Her decision was met with silent nods of approval from the staff who had seen his arrogance cause real damage all day. The central turn of the entire odyssey settled fully into place. At this moment, the man ridiculed that morning for carrying a rusty toolbox had not only saved the factory from catastrophic failure but had also exposed the hollow, self-congratulatory culture of the very people who had once dismissed him without a second thought. Once the factory stabilized and the crisis officially ended, Victoria asked James to join her in the executive boardroom high above the production floor. Only hours earlier she had looked at him with open contempt from that very vantage point, and now she stood before him as someone deeply indebted to him rather than someone above him. She offered what she believed was the ultimate restorative gesture, a position as vice president of engineering, a multi-million-dollar salary, company stock, a private office, and a car befitting his new status. In her mind, This represented the highest correction available to someone in her position. James did not accept immediately, explaining that money certainly mattered but was not enough to address what had truly gone wrong that day. The problem was never whether he was poor or rich, outdated or modern. The real problem was a corporate culture where people in tailored suits were instantly heard while people who carried wrenches were ridiculed without a second thought before anyone bothered to listen to what they had to say. Victoria, for the first time since he had walked back through her doors, offered something that resembled a genuine apology rather than a corporate correction, admitting that she had insulted his skill, his dignity, and nearly destroyed her own company through her arrogance. James laid out new terms if she truly wanted his continued involvement, terms that had nothing to do